The Zenith Hub did not merely occupy space, it devoured it. To Sylas Vane, peering through the reinforced quartz of the diplomatic shuttle, the station looked like a jagged tooth torn from the jaw of a dead god and plated in cold, unyielding obsidian. It was a structure built to intimidate, a sprawling labyrinth of metal and light that housed 10,000 species, yet felt hospitable to none. It was the beating heart of the Korthari hierarchy, a civilization that measured the worth of a soul by the caliber of its cannons. Sylas adjusted his collar. He was 45 years old, though the gray streaking his temples suggested a century of heavy lifting. His suit was the deep, somber blue of a twilight sky back on the blue orchard, and pinned to his lapel was a simple silver circle containing a stylized seed. No swords, no eagles, no roaring predators, just a promise of growth. To the Korthari, it was a joke. To Sylas, it was a heavy burden. Beside him sat Captain Kalen Thorne, a man whose presence felt like a loaded weapon. Thorne was a relic of the Orchard Preservation Corps, his body a map of scars and cybernetic augmentations hidden beneath a crisp uniform. He had been silent since they left the warp gate, his eyes fixed on the tactical overlay of the station's defenses. "Check the perimeter," Thorne whispered, his voice a low rasp that sounded like gravel grinding together. "Those lizards have 48 orbital platforms locked on our heat signature. One twitch and we are stardust." "They are hosts, Kalen," Sylas replied softly. "We are guests. Guests usually get a welcome mat, not a firing squad," Thorne grunted. "Just remember the protocol, Sylas. If the shards start snapping, you get behind me. No heroics." The shuttle hissed as it entered the primary docking bay. The atmosphere inside Zenith Hub was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, musky scent of 1,000 different biologies. As the airlock opened, they were met by 4 Korthari warriors. They stood over 7 feet tall, their skin a shimmering mosaic of dark teal scales, 4 arms folded across chests armored in biological chitin. Their eyes were vertical slits of burning amber, cold and devoid of empathy. "Ambassador Vane," the lead warrior hissed, the sound vibrating in his throat like a malfunctioning engine. "The Overlord is waiting. You have 5 minutes to justify your existence." Sylas stepped forward, his boots echoing on the polished metal floor. "Lead the way." They walked through corridors that seemed designed to make humans feel like ants. The ceilings were 40 meters high, and the walls were adorned with the banners of the 62 species the hierarchy had absorbed or broken. There was no art here, only monuments to conquest. Sylas saw a group of Elani, fragile insectoid beings, scuttle away as the Korthari escort passed. He saw the Torvathi merchants, multi-legged and furred, watching them with a pity that made his skin crawl. They knew. Everyone knew. Humanity was the newest guest at the table, a species with only 47 colony worlds and a fleet that could barely patrol its own borders. In the cold mathematics of the hierarchy, humanity was a rounding error. They reached the grand chamber, a vast amphitheater where the light was dimmed to a predatory gloom. At the center stood the petitioner's floor, a lonely circle of white light surrounded by tiered seating that rose into the darkness. At the highest point sat Overlord Malachor. He was ancient, his scales faded to the color of bone, his 4 hands resting on the armrests of his throne, with the casual arrogance of a being who had never known a true rival. Malachor did not look at Sylas. He looked through him. "Ambassador," the Overlord's voice boomed, amplified by the station's acoustics until it felt like a physical pressure. "You requested this audience to discuss the border incursions." "I did," Sylas said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "In the last 6 months, your fleets have occupied 3 of our outer systems. 12,000 people have been displaced. 47 are dead." Malachor leaned forward, a slow, toothy grin spreading across his face. "Dead? A tragic number. But the galaxy is a hungry place. Little seed. The hierarchy expands because it must. Your worlds are rich in minerals our war machine requires. You have no dreadnoughts to stop us. You have no history of war. Why should we not take what we desire?" Sylas took a breath. He looked at the recording drones hovering in the air. This was being broadcast to the entire galaxy. Millions of eyes were on him. I am not here to beg for mercy, Sylas said. I am here to deliver a message from the High Council of the Blue Orchard. This is not a negotiation. It is a warning. The chamber fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in laughter. It was a harsh, discordant sound. The clicking of the Alani, the rumbling of the Torvati, the sharp barks of the Korthari. A warning? Malachor mocked. From a species that fights with pebbles? Withdraw your forces within 30 standard days, Sylas continued, ignoring the derision. Compensate the families of the fallen. Return our sovereignty. If these terms are not met, we will consider the hierarchy to be in a state of total war with humanity. And we will respond. Malachor stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed Sylas whole. Brave words for a creature so easily crushed. You speak of war, but you do not know the meaning of the word. We have ended civilizations older than your entire history. I know, Sylas whispered. That is why I am sad for you. What did you say? We warned you, Sylas said, looking directly into the camera drone. To my people, I have done my duty. The rest is yours. Don't stop. Malachor gestured with a lower hand. A Korthari guard in the second tier raised a pulse rifle. There was no hesitation, no trial. The bolt of searing energy struck Sylas Vane in the center of his back. He fell, not with a scream, but with a sigh. The silver pin on his lapel spun across the floor, landing in the blood that began to pool on the white light. Thorn was on his knees beside him in a second, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury that no one in that room had ever seen on a human face before. Vane gripped Thorn's hand, his fingers trembling. Kalen, it's time. Don't stop. Sylas Vane died on the petitioner's floor of the Zenith Hub. The broadcast did not cut away. The galaxy watched as a dead man's blood stained the white circle. And in the silence that followed, 1 billion people realized that the joke was no longer funny. Moon Aegis 9 was a tomb of ice and silence, tucked away in the shadow of a gas giant that bled radiation like a punctured vein. Beneath 3 kilometers of frozen methane, the Orchard Preservation Corps lived and breathed in a labyrinth of pressurized tunnels and humming reactors. This was the dark side of human nature, the part that had been hidden from the galaxy for a century. Chi Hui Alara Vance stood on the observation deck of the Ethelgard hangar, her hands clenched behind her back. Below her, 300 ships hung in the artificial gravity, looking less like vessels and more like shards of splintered glass. They were small, sleek, and painted in a matte black that seemed to drink the light. Status, Alara snapped. Her voice was like a whip, honed by years of directing drills in the dark. The tactical officer, a woman named Rin, whose eyes were perpetually bloodshot from data strain, tapped her console. The Ghost Network is at 98% synchronization, Commander. We've uploaded the neural engrams of the 3rd Infantry Division. Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The 3rd Infantry. They had been lost in a border skirmish 5 years ago. Now their memories, their reflexes, and their tactical brilliance were being fed into the ship's central processors. They were the ghosts in the machine, the dead leading the living into a fight they could never truly leave. Is the chronal siphon stable? Alara asked. Stable is a relative term, ma'am, Rin replied. Every time we test the fold jump, we're borrowing time from the next decade. If we push too hard, the causality feedback will fry the pilot's brains. We don't have a choice, Alara said, turning away from the window. The Korthari just executed Sylas Vane on live television. The Orchard is officially at war. Rin froze. Sylas? He was a good man. He was a martyr, Alara said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. And he bought us the only thing we lacked, the moral authority to burn the hierarchy to the ground. Get the pilots in their rigs. We move in 2 hours. The hangar came alive with a frantic, disciplined energy. This wasn't the frantic scramble of a desperate defense. It was the precision of a trap being sprung. For 100 years, humanity had played the part of the harmless neighbor. They had traded grain and poetry while their finest minds worked in the dark, solving the physics of a war the galaxy wasn't ready for. Alara walked down to the pilot's deck. She stopped in front of a young man named Jax. He was barely 20 years old, his skin pale and sweating under the weight of the Neuralink helmet. Scared, kid? Alara asked. Yes, ma'am, Jax whispered. They say when the ghost network kicks in, you can hear them, the ones who died. You don't just hear them, Jax, Alara said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You become them. You'll have the reflexes of a veteran who's seen 1,000 battles. You'll see the enemy's moves before they even think of them. And what happens to me? Jax asked, his voice trembling. Ilara looked him in the eyes. She wanted to lie. She wanted to tell him he'd come back the same. But the humanistic cost of the Ethelgard protocol was written in the classified files she had memorized. Every hour spent in the network eroded the pilot's own identity, replacing it with the collective trauma of the dead. You'll be a hero, Jax, and heroes always give something up. Now get in the seat. We've got a galaxy to wake up. Ilara climbed into her own command rig. As the neural needles slid into the base of her skull, she felt the world dissolve. The hangar vanished, replaced by a crystalline web of data and light. She felt the presence of the others, hundreds of minds merging into a single, terrifying consciousness. She felt the grief of Sylas Vane's death, the anger of 1 billion citizens, and the cold, calculating hunger of the Ghost Network. The ships did not launch. They simply ceased to be in the hangar and began to be in the void-stitch threshold. This was chronal siphoning, a method of travel that didn't use speed, but used the overlap of moments. To an outside observer, the fleet would appear to teleport. To the pilots, it felt like being torn apart and stitched back together with silver thread. Ilara looked at the tactical map. The Korthari Fourth Fleet was currently blockading the system of Oakhaven. 12 warships, 2 carriers, and 800 crew. They were arrogant, their shields lowered, their weapons cold. They thought they were hunting sheep. Attention all units, Ilara's voice echoed through the Ghost Network. 1,000 voices speaking as one. The hierarchy believes in teeth and claws. They believe in the tonnage of steel. Today we show them that the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a wolf. It's the lamb that has stopped running. Target their engines. Disable, then dismantle. Do not stop until the silence is absolute. In the dark of the Kepler corridor, the space began to ripple. A Korthari sensor officer on the lead destroyer noticed a flicker on his screen. A signal that wasn't there, and then was, and then wasn't. He opened his mouth to report it, but the report never came. A beam of energy, dense as a collapsing star, struck the destroyer. It didn't explode. It folded. The metal groaned as it was crushed by a force that ignored its structural integrity. Then the second shot came. Then the third. In 97 seconds, the Fourth Fleet was gone. Not destroyed, pulverized. Ilara sat in her rig, her nose bleeding, her mind screaming with the echoes of dead soldiers cheering in her head. She looked at the display of black dots where blue ships used to be. That's one, she whispered. 46 systems to go. She thought of Sylas, lying in his own blood on the floor of the Zenith Hub. She thought of the silver seed. We're coming, Sylas, she thought, and we're bringing the harvest. The silence following the pulse shot was not an absence of noise, but a suffocating presence that seemed to drain the heat from the grand chamber of Zenith Hub. Captain Kalen Thorne did not scream. He did not roar. He was a man built of tempered steel and old scars, and his training had long ago replaced panic with a cold, predatory focus. He was on his knees before the body of Sylas Vane had even finished settling into the white light of the petitioner's floor. The blood was a vibrant, startling red against the sterile obsidian. It smoked slightly where the pulse bolt had cauterized the edges of the wound, but the internal damage was absolute. Sylas's eyes were still open, reflecting the jagged ceiling of the Korthari station, but the light behind them was fading like a sunset over the rolling hills of the Blue Orchard. Malachor, the overlord of the hierarchy, remained seated at the apex of the tiered seating. He looked down with a boredom that was more insulting than hatred. His four hands were still, his amber eyes tracking the small silver pin that had rolled into a gutter of the floor. The warning is acknowledged, Malachor said, his voice carrying through the chamber without the aid of speakers. The messenger is dismissed. Kalen Thorne reached out and closed Sylas's eyes. His fingers were steady, but his mind was a storm of tactical assessments and raw, jagged grief. He reached for the silver seed pin, his cybernetic hand clicking softly as he pocketed the ruined emblem. He stood up slowly, lifting Silas's body as if it weighed nothing. The weight of a dead man was supposed to be heavy, but to Thorn, it felt like carrying the ghost of a dream that had finally been put to rest. Thorn turned to face the tiered seats. Thousands of alien delegates watched him. Some looked away in shame, others stared with a morbid curiosity, but the Korthari in the upper tiers were already whispering among themselves, checking their data pads, bored with the spectacle. "You think this is over," Thorn said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the marrow of everyone present. He wasn't speaking to the room. He was speaking to the recording drones that were still transmitting his face to every corner of the known galaxy. Malachor leaned back, his scales clicking. "It is over, Captain. Your species has been measured. You have no teeth. You have no dreadnoughts. You have only words, and words do not stop a planetary siege." Thorn didn't look at the Overlord. He looked at the nearest camera drone, his gaze piercing through the lens. "The Orchard hasn't forgotten how to fight," Thorn whispered, his voice carrying a gritty, serrated edge. "We just haven't had a reason to be monsters for a long time." "You just gave us one." He began to walk. The Korthari guards shifted their weight, their biological chitin armor creaking, but they didn't block his path. There was something about the way Thorn carried the body, a grim, unshakable purpose, that made even the 7-foot-tall warriors hesitate. He was a man who had already decided he was dead, and there is nothing more dangerous than a soldier who has stopped calculating his own survival. As Thorn reached the airlock of the diplomatic shuttle, his internal comms link buzzed. It was a high-priority encrypted burst from the Orchard Preservation Corps. He didn't check it until the shuttle was clear of the station's outer defense ring, drifting into the cold safety of the void. The message was 3 words long. "Ethelgard is live." Thorn sat in the pilot's seat, the body of his friend secured in the back. He looked at the 48 orbital weapons platforms of Zenith Hub. They looked like jewels in the dark, each one capable of turning a continent to ash. For 11 years, humanity had lived in the shadow of those guns. For 11 years, they had played the part of the polite, harmless neighbor. "Check the board," Thorn muttered to the shuttle's AI. "Give me the feed from the Kepler corridor." The tactical display flickered to life. He saw the remains of the Korthari Fourth Fleet. It wasn't a debris field. It was a smear of atomic dust. 12 warships, including 2 carriers, had been erased from reality in less than 2 minutes. There were no survivors. There were no distress calls. There was only a looped recording playing on the hierarchy's military frequencies. "We warned you." Thorn felt a cold, hollow satisfaction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver seed. It was bent. The pin snapped. The metal stained with Silas's blood. "You did it, old man," Thorn whispered. "You made them look at us." But as he stared at the tactical data, a flicker of doubt touched his mind. He knew Alara Vance. He knew what the Ethelgard protocol was. He knew that the ships weren't being piloted by living men alone. They were being guided by the echoes, the digital ghosts of dead soldiers. To destroy the Fourth Fleet that quickly, the ghost network must have been running at a burn rate that would melt a human brain. The hierarchy was a monster, yes. It was a predator that understood only strength. But as Thorn looked at the pulverized remains of 12,000 Korthari soldiers, he wondered if humanity was about to trade its soul for a bigger set of claws. Back on Zenith Hub, the laughter had stopped. Malachor was no longer bored. A frantic sub-commander had scrambled to the petitioner's floor, his scales a pale, sickly gray. He was whispering into the Overlord's ear, his amber eyes darting toward the empty space where the human ambassador had stood minutes before. "What do you mean, gone?" Malachor's voice was no longer a boom. It was a hiss of pure disbelief. "The entire Fourth Fleet," the sub-commander stammered. "Gone. The Kepler corridor is a graveyard. Our sensors didn't even pick up a thermal signature. It was like the void itself swallowed them." Malachor stood up. The movement was so sudden that the delegates in the lower tiers flinched. He looked at the spot where Sylas Vane's blood was still drying. He remembered the ambassador's face. Not the fear, but the sadness. They were hiding, Malachor realized, his 4 hands clenching into fists. For 11 years, they were hiding in plain sight. "Mobilize the Grand Fleet," Malachor roared. "I want every ship we have pointed at the Blue Orchard. If they want a war, we will give them an annihilation." The news spread through the station like a virus. The Alani stopped their clicking. The Torvathi merchants closed their stalls and began moving their credits into deep space accounts. The hierarchy was no longer the only predator in the woods. Kalen Thorne, watching the station shrink in his rearview monitors, knew that the real fight was only beginning. He wasn't a diplomat. He didn't believe in seeds or growth. He was a soldier who had spent 20 years in the dirt, and he knew that when you kill a monster, you have to be careful not to leave a vacuum. He keyed the comms for Aegis 9. Commander Vance, this is Thorne. The package is cold. The seeds are sown. How are your pilots holding up? There was a long pause. When Alara Vance's voice came back, it sounded different. It was sharper, colder, as if it were being processed through 1,000 layers of static. They aren't holding up, Thorne. They're ascending. We're pushing the Ghost Network to 105%. The first strike was a success, but the feedback is heavy. He's seeing things that happened 3 years ago. Thorne gripped the flight stick. Tell him to stay on mission, Alara. Tell him we can't stop. I know, Alara replied. But Thorne, when this is over, who's going to be left to remember why we started? Thorne didn't have an answer. He looked at the silver pin in his hand. He thought of Silas's final words. Don't stop. It was a command, but also a warning. Because once the human race decided to stop being the victim and started being the storm, there was no telling where the wind would blow. The shuttle entered the warp gate, leaving Zenith Hub behind. Behind him, the Korthari Empire was waking up, a wounded beast reaching for its weapons. But ahead of him, humanity was becoming something the galaxy had never seen. A species that had decided that being small was no longer an option, no matter the cost. The air inside Moon Aegis 9 smelled like scorched electronics and recycled sweat. It was a heavy metallic scent that seemed to stick to the back of Alara Vance's throat. She sat in the command rig of the United Earth Navy ship Voss, her mind a fraying rope tied to 300 different points of consciousness. Commander, we have a breach in Section 7. Rin's voice crackled through the neural link. Jax is flatlining. His heart rate is 240. The network is trying to eat him. Alara didn't hesitate. She slammed her mental overrides, diving into the deep architecture of the Ghost Network. It was like falling into a sea of liquid glass. Images flashed past her. Not her own memories, but the jagged, bloody fragments of the 3rd Infantry's final stand. She saw the orange dust of a nameless moon, heard the scream of a pulse rifle, felt the heat of a brother dying in her arms. It wasn't hers, but it felt like it. That was the trap of the Ethelgard protocol. It didn't just give you the skills of the dead, it gave you their ghosts. Jax, Alara shouted in the psychic dark. Pull back! You're oversinking! She found him in a corner of the neural map. The young pilot was curled into a ball, his digital avatar flickering between his own face and the face of a grizzled sergeant who had died 5 years before. I can't, Jax whimpered, his voice a distorted echo. The Sarge, he won't let go. He's still trying to save the perimeter. He doesn't know the war is over for him. He's not real, Jax. Alara pushed her will against the feedback loop. He's an engram, a recording. You're the one in the seat. You're the one who has to fly. But the sergeant's memory was strong. It was fueled by the raw, unrefined rage of a man who had died being laughed at by Korthari overseers. That rage was the fuel for the Ethelgard ships. It was what allowed them to ignore the laws of physics and strike with the precision of a scalpel. But it was a hungry fuel. It wanted more than just targets. It wanted hosts. Alara grabbed Jax's avatar and pulled. For a moment, she felt the sergeant's anger wash over her. It was a wave of black fire that threatened to consume everything she was. She saw her own father, her own home on the Blue Orchard, and for a terrifying second, she didn't care if they burned as long as she could feel the Korthari snap under her fingers. She bit her tongue, the physical pain grounding her. She shoved Jax out of the loop and slammed the firewall shut. The connection severed with a snap that felt like a tooth breaking. Alara gasped, her eyes snapping open in the real world. She was shaking, her flight suit soaked in cold sweat. Across the command deck, Jax had collapsed in his rig, the medical droids already swarming him with sedatives and stabilizers. Report, Alara croaked, her voice failing her. Rin looked up from her console, her face pale. Jax is alive. But the feedback loop was a mess. He lost about 6 months of personal memory, Commander. He doesn't remember his sister's name. He thinks he's from a colony on New Terra that was glassed 3 years ago. Ilara closed her eyes. The cost. It was always the cost. To build a fleet that could destroy the hierarchy, they had to sacrifice the very thing they were fighting to protect. They were saving humanity by erasing humans. We can't stop, Rin, Ilara said, more to herself than to her officer. Sylas is dead. Thorn is on his way back with the body. The Korthari are mobilizing their grand fleet. If we don't hit them now, if we don't maintain the pressure, they'll realize we only have 300 ships. But the pilots are hitting their limit, Rin argued, her voice trembling. The Ghost Network isn't a weapon, Ilara. It's a parasite. The more we use it, the less of us is left. We're losing the war for our own identity before we even finish the first campaign. Ilara stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She walked over to Jax's rig. The boy looked small, his face slack under the medication. He had been a painter before he joined the OPC. He used to talk about the way the light hit the gas giant's rings. Now his mind was a patchwork of dead men's memories. I know, Ilara whispered, but if we lose, there won't be anyone left to remember anything. She turned back to the tactical display. The Korthari Grand Fleet was moving. 412 warships, led by the Imperial Sovereign, Malakor's personal dreadnought. It was a wall of steel and malice moving toward the Kepler corridor. They were coming for revenge. They were coming because they thought they were the giants. Prepare the next jump, Ilara ordered. We're going to intercept them at the mouth of the corridor. Commander, we haven't finished the maintenance on the chronal siphons, Rin protested. The heat buildup alone could... Do it, Ilara snapped. We don't have time for maintenance. We're borrowing time from the future anyway. What's a few more hours of heat? As the crew scrambled to comply, Ilara felt a presence at her shoulder. It wasn't a ghost, but a man who looked like one. Captain Kalen Thorn had arrived, his uniform still stained with the dust of Zenith Hub. He looked at Jax, then at Ilara. He's gone, isn't he? Thorn asked, his voice low. Jax? He's stabilizing, Ilara said. I'm not talking about his vitals, Ilara. I'm talking about the kid who liked to paint. He's KIA, even if his heart is still beating. Ilara turned on him, her eyes flashing with a cold, desperate light. What do you want from me, Thorn? You were the one who told me we had to be monsters. You were the one who watched Sylas die. I did, Thorn said. And I'm telling you now, as a soldier who's seen too many good men turn into rubble, that we are crossing a line we can't see yet. Sylas wanted peace. He died for it. If we win this war but lose our humanity in the process, then the Korthari won the moment they fired that pulse bolt. Ilara felt the weight of the Ghost Network pressing against the back of her mind. She could hear the voices of the 3rd Infantry, a low hum of static and rage that never quite went away. They wanted to fight. They wanted to burn. And a part of her, the part that had watched the Korthari take world after world, wanted it too. We're not the Korthari, Thorn, Ilara said. We don't kill because we're bored. We don't conquer because we can. We fight because we have to. Thorn looked at the silver pin he had placed on the command table. It was the whole one, the one he had replaced Sylas's broken emblem with. Just make sure you know when to stop, Ilara, because the network doesn't have a stop button. It only has a hunger. The alarm for the jump sequence began to blare. A deep, vibrating hum filled the station as the chronal siphons began to draw energy from the fabric of spacetime. The lights flickered, the air grew cold, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Ilara climbed back into her rig. As the needles engaged, she felt the ghosts waiting for her. They were louder now, more insistent. They were the shadows of 100,000 human lives, and they were all pointing in the same direction, toward the enemy. The Korthari Grand Fleet didn't know what was coming. They thought they were the storm. They thought they were the absolute truth of the galaxy. They were wrong. The human fleet materialized in the Kepler corridor, 300 shards of glass in a sphere of coordinated death. They didn't wait for a hail. They didn't wait for a negotiation. They opened fire with weapons that operated on principles the Korthari wouldn't understand for another 1,000 years. Ilara felt every shot. She felt the heat of the beams, the vibration of the hulls, the cold satisfaction of the ghosts as Korthari dreadnoughts began to fold inward, like crushed tin. It was beautiful and terrible, a symphony of destruction that echoed across the stars. But deep inside the network, in a place the tactical displays couldn't see, Ilara felt something else. She felt a piece of herself go dark. She forgot the name of the street she grew up on. She forgot the smell of her mother's cooking. She forgot the feeling of a warm summer day. She was winning the war, but she was losing herself, one memory at a time. As the Imperial Sovereign appeared on the monitors, its massive hull bristling with weapons, Ilara felt the ghosts surge with a primal, terrifying joy. They wanted the Overlord. They wanted the head of the beast. "Don't stop," the network whispered in her mind. Ilara gritted her teeth, her nose beginning to bleed again. "I won't," she whispered back. The human fleet surged forward, 300 ships moving as a single, lethal organism. They were the small things of the galaxy, the rounding errors, the footnotes, and they were about to write the final chapter of the Korthari Empire in blood and starlight. But as the first beam struck the Sovereign's shields, Ilara saw a flicker in the static. It was a memory, not a soldier's, but her own. It was a memory of Sylas Vane, sitting in a garden on the Blue Orchard, holding a handful of seeds. "The most powerful thing in the universe isn't a gun, Ilara," he had said. "It's the patience to let something grow." Ilara closed her eyes against the light of the explosion. "I'm sorry, Sylas," she thought, "but the garden is on fire, and I have to be the rain." The war for the galaxy had begun in earnest, and as the Korthari Grand Fleet began to die, the human race began to change into something that would haunt the stars for a long, long time. The margin was narrow, and the cost was absolute. But as the ghosts of the 3rd Infantry roared in her mind, Ilara Vance realized that the difference between a hero and a monster was often just a matter of who was still standing when the lights went out. She pushed the network to 110%. The world turned to white, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The engagement lasted exactly 342 seconds. In that time, the largest military mobilization in Korthari history was reduced to particles. The Imperial Sovereign, a ship that had stood as a symbol of terror for centuries, was a hollowed-out shell drifting in the dark. Ilara disconnected from the rig, her body convulsing as the neural feedback ebbed away. She fell to the floor of the command deck, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rin was there, catching her, her face a mask of horror. "We did it," Rin whispered. They're gone." Ilara looked up at the monitors. The black space was filled with the glittering dust of a dead empire. She should have felt victory. She should have felt relief. But all she felt was the cold, hollow hunger of the network, waiting for the next jump, waiting for the next memory to consume. She looked at Kalen Thorne, who was standing by the silver pin. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at her, and in his eyes she saw the one thing she feared more than the Korthari. She saw pity. The war wasn't over. The fight for the galaxy was just the beginning. The real battle was for what was left of the people who were fighting it. Ilara stood up, her legs shaking, her mind a patchwork of stars and shadows. "Prepare the next jump," she said, her voice sounding like someone else's. "We're going to Zenith Hub. We're going to finish this." And the ghosts in her head screamed in approval. They had warned the Korthari. They had warned the galaxy. Now they were going to show them what happens when the small things finally stop being afraid and start being the nightmare. The Blue Orchard was no longer a garden. It was a forge, and the iron was being tempered in a fire that would never go out. The cost was 3,412 memories. And Ilara Vance was just getting started. Zenith Hub was no longer a monument to divine arrogance. As the 300 black mat ships of the Orchard Preservation Corps exited the chronal fold, the station looked like a trapped beast, its obsidian surfaces reflecting the flickering, dying lights of the Korthari Fourth Fleet's remains. The human vessels, nicknamed shards, did not emerge with the roaring thunder of traditional warp drives. They manifested in a terrifying surgical silence, occupying the spaces between heartbeats. Chi Hui Ilara Vance sat in the command rig of the UN Voss, but sitting was a concept that no longer applied to her. Her nervous system had been siphoned into the ghost network. Her consciousness expanded across the entire fleet. She was the hull of every ship. She was the heat of every reactor. She was the hunger of every weapon. But more than that, she was the host for 1,000 angry ghosts. The 3rd Infantry engrams were screaming. In the psychic architecture of the network, the scream manifested as a wall of jagged white noise, a collective demand for the total erasure of the Korthari species. Every time Ilara looked at the Zenith Hub through the fleet sensors, she saw not a station, but a target. "Commander, sensors are going haywire." Rin's voice filtered through the static, sounding as if it were coming from the bottom of a deep well. "The Korthari are dumping their heat sinks. They're trying to create a sensor ghost field to mask their primary weapon platforms. It's a mess down there, a real clusterfuck of thermal signatures." Ilara didn't need the sensors. She could feel the Korthari's fear. It was a cold, vibrating frequency that hummed through the hulls of her ships. "Ignore the ghost field," Ilara said, her voice echoing with the layered resonance of the sergeant's engram. "They're stalling. They think we're still playing by their rules. They think we need to see them to kill them. We don't. We just need to know where they were 3 seconds ago." "Vance, check your fire," Kalen Thorne's voice cut through. He was on the bridge of the Voss, his physical presence a grounding wire for Ilara's drifting mind. "The lower tiers of that station are packed with civilians, Ilani, Torvathi, Cathani refugees. If you open up with the siphons, you're not just hitting the warriors. You're glassing everything that breathes in there." Ilara felt the sergeant's engram surge with a dark, oily joy. "They watched Sylas die," the voice whispered in her mind. "They laughed. Let them burn in the same light." "War is a rounding error, Thorne," Ilara muttered, her eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural blue light. "You said it yourself. We have to be monsters." "I said we had to be monsters to win, not that we had to stay that way," Thorne shouted, stepping toward the command rig. The guards moved to block him, but he shoved past them. "Look at the telemetry, Ilara. The Korthari military has already evacuated the command spire. They've left the administrative staff and the conquered species behind as meat shields. If you pull the trigger, you're doing exactly what they expect. You're becoming the next overlord." Ilara's mind flickered. She tried to remember the face of the Cathani delegate she had seen in the broadcast, the small, crystalline figure who looked like a piece of frozen music. She tried to remember why she was here, but the memory was slippery, like a wet stone. Instead, she remembered the smell of ozone in a Korthari interrogation room. She remembered the sound of a human spine snapping under a teal-scaled hand. "Targets locked," Ilara whispered. The 300 shards began to rotate, their needle-like bows pointing toward the heart of Zenith Hub. The chronal siphons began to hum, drawing energy from the future, stealing time to fuel a strike that would occur before the Korthari could even register the threat. "Ilara, listen to me." Thorne's voice was desperate now. "Don't let the ghosts drive. You're still the pilot. If you do this, there's no coming back. You'll be just another ghost in the network, another engram of hate." "I'm already gone, Thorne," Ilara said, and for a second her own voice broke through the static. Thin, tired, and full of a grief that had no bottom. "There's so little left of me. I can't remember the name of my first dog. I can't remember what color the sky was on the day I joined the Corps. All I have left is the mission. The mission was to save us, not to replace our souls with obsidian." The shards began to glow. The space around Zenith Hub began to warp and ripple, the stars behind the station distorting into elongated streaks of light. The Korthari defense platforms opened fire, a desperate, frantic barrage of plasma and kinetic slugs. But the shards weren't there. They were shifting in and out of the time stream, the incoming fire passing through ghosts and echoes. "First salvo in 5, 4, Rin counted down, her voice trembling. Ilara felt her finger on the psychic trigger. The sergeant was laughing now, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. The memory of the orange dust moon was so vivid, she could taste it. She could feel the weight of the rifle in her hands. She was ready. She wanted the burn. Then a small, crystalline vibration hit the network. It wasn't a tactical signal. It wasn't a weapon lock. It was a frequency, a sequence of notes that defied the cold logic of the vacuum. It was the morning song. The Cathani delegate on the station had started to sing. He wasn't singing into a microphone. He was singing into the station's structural lattice, his crystalline body resonating against the obsidian walls. The sound was being picked up by the shard's ultra-sensitive acoustic sensors, filtered through the ghost network, and delivered directly into Alara's mind. It was a morning song for a world that had never seen a sun. It was a song about the fragility of light and the persistence of memory. The sergeant's laughter faltered. The wall of white noise in the network began to crack. Ilara saw a flash of a memory, her own this time. She was 7 years old, standing in a field of blue-petaled flowers on the blue orchard. Her mother was holding her hand, pointing at a star that was just beginning to blink in the twilight. "That's where we came from, Ilara," her mother had said, "and no matter how far we go, we have to carry that light with us. Otherwise, we're just wandering in the dark." "Abort," Ilara whispered. "What?" Rin's voice was a sharp spike of confusion. "Commander, we're at 99% charge. If we abort now, the back pressure will blow the siphons. We'll lose half the fleet." "I said abort!" Ilara roared, her voice finally her own. She fought the ghosts, shoving the sergeant's rage back into the dark corners of the network. She seized control of the 300 ships, her will acting as a physical brake on the chronal energy. The space around Zenith Hub screamed as the energy was forced back into the siphons. The shards bucked and groaned, their matte black hulls vibrating with a violence that threatened to tear them apart. On the bridge of the Voss, consoles exploded in showers of sparks. Rin was thrown from her seat, and Thorn grabbed a support rail to keep from being crushed against the wall. Ilara felt the feedback. It was like 1,000 needles of white-hot ice being driven into her brain. She screamed as her memories, the precious few she had left, were charred by the backflow. She saw the blue flowers turn to ash. She saw her mother's face dissolve into static. She saw the star in the twilight go dark. But she didn't pull the trigger. The shards drifted in the silence, their engines glowing a dull, angry red. Zenith Hub remained standing, its obsidian spires scarred but intact. The Korthari defense fire had stopped, the warriors on the station frozen in a state of shock. They had been ready to die in a firestorm. They were not ready for mercy. Ilara slumped in her rig, her nose and ears bleeding, her eyes rolled back in her head. The ghost network hummed with a low, sullen disappointment, the spirits of the 3rd Infantry retreating like a tide. Thorn was at her side in an instant, his cybernetic hand trembling as he wiped the blood from her face. "Ilara? Ilara, talk to me." She opened her eyes, but she didn't see him. She saw the void. She saw the silence. I can't remember her name," Ilara whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "The woman in the garden. My mother. I know she was there. I know she loved me. But her name, it's gone, Thorn. It's just black." Thorn pulled her from the rig, his face a mask of grief. "It's okay, Ilara. It's okay. We're still here. You didn't do it. You stayed human." "Did I?" Ilara looked at her hands. They looked like porcelain in the emergency lighting, fragile and pale. "Or did I just trade my mother for the lives of my enemies?" "You traded vengeance for a chance at peace," Thorn said, his voice firm, "and that is the only trade that matters." Across the station, the airlocks began to open. Not for warriors, but for shuttles. Hundreds of them. The conquered species were fleeing, realizing that the giants were no longer fighting each other, but were instead staring into the abyss they had created. But the Korthari High Command was not finished. In the dark heart of the station, Overlord Malachor watched the human fleet drift. He didn't see a miracle of mercy. He saw a moment of weakness. He reached for the remote trigger for the station's self-destruct. If he couldn't rule the galaxy, he would leave it a graveyard. "If the small things want to play at being gods," Malachor hissed, his amber eyes burning with a final, lethal spite, "let them see how a god dies." The turning point had been reached. Humanity had chosen to spare their enemies, but the enemy was not yet ready to be saved. And in the cold silence of the Zenith Hub, the cost of that choice was about to become very, very real. The alarm that began to wail through Moon Aegis 9 was different from the combat klaxons. It was a low-frequency moan, a mechanical lament that indicated a total system collapse. On the bridge of the Voss, the tactical displays flickered between blood-red warnings and static. "Overload! The Korthari are redlining the station's core!" Rin shouted, her fingers flying across a terminal that was half-melted. "Malachor isn't trying to fight us anymore. He's turning the entire Zenith Hub into a localized supernova. If that core blows, it'll take the entire system with it. Every refugee shuttle, every Alani child, every shard of our fleet, gone. Kaelin Thorne looked at Alara. She was still leaning against him, her body limp, her mind a fragmented mirror. Can we jump? Can we siphon enough time to get the fleet out? Not with the back pressure we just took, Rin said, her voice cracking. The siphons are slagged. We're sitting ducks, Thorne. We've got maybe 10 minutes before the obsidian tooth becomes a sun. Alara's eyes snapped into focus. The blue light wasn't there anymore, but in its place was a hard, cold clarity. She shoved herself off Thorne and stood, her legs shaking but her spine straight. She looked at the monitor, at the thousands of refugee ships frantically trying to clear the station's blast radius. They were too slow. They were too many. The Ghost Network, Alara said. Her voice was thin, but it had the weight of a decree. No, Thorne stepped in front of her. Alara, you can't go back in. Your neural pathways are already scorched. If you sink again, there won't be anything left to pull out. You'll be a vegetable, or worse, you'll just dissolve. There are 20,000 non-combatants on those shuttles, Thorne, Alara said, her gaze steady. The Cathani singer is on one of them. If I don't go back in, the morning song ends today. Forever. We can find another way. There is no other way. The only thing fast enough to stabilize a collapsing Korthari core is a chronal anchor. And the only thing that can manifest an anchor that size is the network. I have to borrow more than just time, Thorne. I have to borrow the will of everyone who's already died. She pushed past him, her movements clinical and cold. She climbed back into the command rig, the needle sliding into her neck with a wet, sickening click. Don't do this, Vance, Thorne whispered, his hand on the glass of the rig. Don't let them take the rest of you. The rest of me is just a collection of holes where my memories used to be, Thorne, Alara said, her voice already beginning to distort. Tell Sylas. Tell him the seed grew, even if it grew into a thorn. She slammed the connection home. The Ghost Network didn't just welcome her back. It lunged for her. It was a starving animal that had been denied its kill. The sergeant's rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching void, the collective grief of 3 centuries of human suffering. She felt the weight of every person who had ever been told they were too small, every soul that had been crushed by the Korthari boot. But she didn't use the rage. She used the weight. I am the anchor, Alara thought, her mind expanding until she could feel the edges of the galaxy. I am the memory of the fallen. I am the silence that follows the warning. She reached out with the 300 shards, weaving a web of chronal energy around the Zenith Hub. She wasn't trying to destroy the station. She was trying to freeze it. She was siphoning time not to move fast, but to make the core move slow. She was creating a bubble where 10 minutes would last 1,000 years. The strain was absolute. Alara's physical body began to convulse in the rig, her skin turning a translucent, ghostly white. On the monitors, the Voss's hull began to flake away in layers of metallic ash. She's burning up, Rin screamed. The soul burn is off the charts. She's pulling energy from her own synaptic foundations. Alara didn't hear her. She was standing on the petitioner's floor in her mind, but the floor was no longer obsidian. It was made of blue flowers, and standing across from her was Sylas Vane. He looked younger, his face free of the yuan of diplomacy. He was holding a handful of silver seeds. You stayed, Alara, Sylas said, his voice a gentle breeze. You didn't stop. I'm losing everything, Sylas, Alara cried, her digital form flickering. I can't see your face clearly anymore. I can't remember why I'm here. It's okay, Sylas smiled. The garden doesn't need to remember who planted it. It just needs to grow. Outside, in the real world, the Zenith Hub began to glow with a brilliant frozen light. The explosion didn't happen. The core's energy was caught in a chronal loop, a swirling vortex of blue and gold that hung in the void like a captured star. The refugee shuttles cleared the perimeter, their sensors baffled by the impossible physics of the human fleet. Then the snap. The chronal anchor held, but the cost was claimed. The Ghost Network went silent. The 300 shards dropped out of their formations, their lights going dark as the engrams were finally released. The engrams didn't just vanish. They moved through Alara, a final, rushing tide of souls returning to the void, and they took the last of her with them. Thorn smashed the glass of the rig, pulling Alara out as the needles retracted. She was cold. Her eyes were open, but they were empty. Not the emptiness of death, but the emptiness of a house where the owner has moved out and taken all the furniture. Alara? Thorn's voice was a sob. She looked at him. She blinked. Who are you? Thorn froze. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of ozone and the faint lingering smell of blue flowers. I'm Kalen. I'm your friend. We saved them, Alara. Them? She whispered. Who are they? She looked at the monitor. The Zenith Hub was a monument of ice and light, a beautiful, terrifying tomb for an empire. She looked at the shards drifting like dead leaves. It's very quiet, Alara said, her voice small and sweet, like a child's. I think I'd like to go home now. Do I have a home? Thorn pulled her close, his cybernetic hand stroking her hair. Yes, Alara, you have a home. It's a garden, and the sky is always blue. The battle for Zenith Hub was over. The Korthari hierarchy was a memory. The galaxy was free. But as the human fleet began its slow, manual crawl back toward the Blue Orchard, there was no cheering. The humans had won the war. They had saved the small things. They had proven that they were not the monsters the Korthari wanted them to be, but they had paid for that victory with the very thing that made the victory worth having. Thorn sat on the deck, holding the woman who had become a ghost to save a galaxy, and he realized that the warning Sylas Vane had given wasn't for the Korthari. It was for them. Don't stop. Because once you start sacrificing yourself to save the world, you might find that by the time the world is safe, there's nothing left of you to enjoy it. As the Voss entered the warp gate for the final time, a single signal came through the comms. It wasn't from Earth. It wasn't from the fleet. It was a recording played on a low frequency from one of the refugee shuttles. It was the morning song. The Kathani was still singing. And for the first time in 20 years, the song didn't sound like a lament. It sounded like a beginning. Alara smiled at the sound, though she didn't know why. She reached into her pocket and found a silver pin, a circle with a seed. She held it up to the light, her eyes reflecting the silver. It's pretty, she whispered. It's everything, Thorn replied. The galaxy was wide and the stars were many, and for the first time in 10,000 years, they were all safe. But the humans of the Blue Orchard would never be the same. They were a species of ghosts now, carrying the weight of a peace they could no longer fully remember. The margin had been narrow. The cost had been absolute. But as the morning song filled the bridge, Kalen Thorn knew that Sylas Vane would have been proud. Not because they were strong, not because they were fast, but because when the time came to pull the trigger, they chose to be the garden instead of the fire. And in a galaxy full of predators, that was the most terrifying warning of all. The Korthari were gone, the giants were fallen, and the small things were finally awake. Let's get her home, Thorn said to the empty bridge. The Voss disappeared into the light, leaving the frozen star of Zenith Hub behind, a reminder for every species that would ever come after that humanity was a species that remembered, even when they had forgotten their own names. The soul burn had taken Alara Vance's past, but it had given the galaxy a future. And in the cold mathematics of the universe, that was a rounding error that even the gods couldn't ignore. The journey home would take weeks, and every day Thorn would tell Alara the story of a girl in a garden and a man with a seed. He would tell her until the words became her new memories, until the holes in her mind were filled with the stories of the people she had saved. Because that is what humans do. We don't just survive. We tell the stories that make survival mean something, and we never, ever stop. The final broadcast from Zenith Hub didn't show the explosion. It showed the human fleet holding the line. It showed the mercy of the shards. And as the feed went black, every sentient being in the galaxy knew that the era of the hierarchy was over. The era of the seed had begun. The Blue Orchard was not a single planet, but a delicate tapestry of 7 terraformed moons, orbiting a sapphire gas giant named Ethelgard. It was a place of high-altitude violet meadows and oceans so clear you could see the thermal vents glowing 3 kilometers below the surface. To a human who remembered their past, it was paradise. To Alara Vance, it was a beautiful, terrifying stranger. She sat on a bench made of white cedar, overlooking the glass valley of Moon Primus. Beside her, a cup of tea grew cold. She did not know if she liked tea. She did not know if she liked the view. Every few minutes, she would look down at her hands, surprised by the fine lines on her palms and the faint scar on her right thumb. They were her hands, she was told. She had earned those scars in a place called the Kepler Corridor. But to Alara, those were just words, hollow vessels with no wine inside. Kalen Thorne approached her from the garden path. He walked with a limp now, a souvenir from the chaos on Zenith Hub. He was wearing civilian clothes, a loose linen shirt and trousers, but his eyes remained those of a man who slept with a knife under his pillow. "Tea's cold, Alara," he said softly. "I think I was waiting for it to tell me a story," she replied. Her voice was quiet, lacking the serrated edge that had once commanded fleets. "Kalen, I saw a woman in the market today. She looked at me and started to cry. She called me the ghost of the orchard. Why would she call me a ghost if I'm sitting right here?" Thorne sat beside her, his weight making the cedar bench groan. "Because you gave them back their lives, Alara. And in their heads, that kind of debt feels like a haunting. They don't know how to look at you without seeing the 300 ships you held in your hand." "I don't feel like a fleet," she whispered. "I feel like a room where someone took all the furniture and left the windows open. The wind just blows right through me." "That's because you're empty, kid," Thorne said, slipping into the gritty cadence of the barracks. "And honestly, maybe that's a blessing. Most of us are so full of junk, regrets, bad memories, old grudges, that we can't breathe. You've got a clean slate. You could be a baker. You could be a gardener. You could just be." Ilara looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of recognition. "Did I love being a soldier, Kalen? Be honest with me. Was I happy?" Thorne looked away, his gaze fixing on the violet horizon. "You were good at it. In our line of work, good is usually a long way from happy. You were the kind of officer who'd jump on a grenade to save a private's bootlaces. You had a fire in you, Alara, but fire doesn't care what it burns. By the end, it was burning you." The peace of the afternoon was shattered by a high-pitched whine from Thorne's wristcom. It was a frequency Alara didn't recognize, but the way Thorne's body went rigid told her everything she needed to know. The good days were over. "Talk to me," Thorne snapped into the comms. "Captain, we've got a major situation topside." Rin's voice crackled through, sounding frantic. "It's the Iron Scale, a Korthari remnant fleet. They didn't follow the High Commander's surrender orders. They've bypassed the outer buoys, and they're moving on the Ceresis agricultural moon. Kalen, they're not looking to occupy. They're launching scorched earth protocols. They've already glassed 2 orbital silos. Civilian casualties are already in the thousands." Thorne stood up, his hand reflexively reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. "What about the Defense Corps? Where are our ships?" "Scuttled or in dry dock for repairs," Rin said, her voice breaking. "The Ghost Network is the only thing fast enough to intercept, but we don't have a pilot. The engrams are screaming, Kalen. Without a host to filter the feedback, the network is just a storm of rage. If we try to jump it now, the ships will just tear themselves apart." Alara stood up as well. The wind caught her hair, and for a brief, flickering second, a memory that wasn't a memory sparked in her mind. Not a picture, but a feeling. The feeling of being a needle in the dark. The feeling of being the only thing standing between the fire and the flowers. "I have to go," Ilara said. "Negative." Thorne turned on her, his face a mask of iron. "You are KIA in spirit, Alara. You've done your time. You don't even know your own middle name. You are not stepping back into that meat grinder." "If I don't, the people on Ceresis won't have middle names either," she said. It was a strange thing to say, but it felt right. "Kalen, I'm empty. You said it yourself. Maybe that's why I'm the only one who can do this. The network is full of rage because it's full of dead people who died hating the Korthari. If you put a person in there who's already full of their own hate, the feedback loop kills them. But I have nothing to feed the fire." "You'll lose the rest, Alara." Thorne grabbed her shoulders, his voice shaking. "Whatever little bits of you are still in there. The way you like your tea, the way you look at the stars. It'll all be gone. You'll just be a ghost, a literal ghost. I'd rather be a ghost that saved a moon than a woman who sat on a bench and watched it burn, she replied. The journey to the OPC command center was a blur of high-speed transit and frantic briefings. The air in the underground facility was thick with the scent of ozone and the desperate energy of technicians working on hardware that was never meant to be used again. Rin met them at the entrance to the hangar, her face pale, her eyes fixed on Alara with a mixture of hope and profound guilt. The Iron Scale is led by General Vrax, Rin said, walking them toward the command rig. He's a true believer, one of those lizard brains who thinks the hierarchy's fall was a human trick. He's got 80 warships and a planetary cracker. He's 5 minutes out from Sirius's main colony. Show me the rig, Alara said. The command rig of the UEN Voss looked different this time. It looked like a cage. The glass was still cracked from Thorn's fist, and the neural needles were humming with a low, predatory vibration. Alara looked at the seat and felt a wave of nausea. Her body remembered the pain, even if her mind did not. Alara, wait, Thorn stepped forward, holding out a small object. It was the silver seed pin, the one he had rescued from Zenith Hub. Take this. Don't let go of it. Let it be your tether. If you start to drift too far into the static, think about the garden. Think about the tea. She took the pin, the cool metal grounding her for a heartbeat. I'll try, Kalen, but if I don't come back, don't let them make me into a statue. Just plant a tree, something that grows. She climbed into the seat, the needles engaged with a sharp, cold sting. The ghost network didn't trickle in this time. It exploded. Alara felt the consciousness of 300 ships slam into her mind like a tidal wave. She felt the sergeant's rage, the private's fear, the pilot's last second of life. It was a chaotic, howling symphony of death. But this time, Alara didn't fight the tide. She didn't build firewalls or psychic barriers. She simply opened the doors. It's okay, she whispered into the dark. I know you're angry. I know it hurts. But we aren't here to kill today. We're here to hold the line. The network hesitated. The white noise of the sergeant's engram lowered in pitch. The ships of the Orchard Preservation Corps, drifting in dry dock, suddenly flared to life. Their matte black hulls began to hum with a blue light that was softer than before, less like a weapon and more like a heartbeat. Sync achieved, Rin's voice echoed in the command center. 100%, no feedback spikes. How is she doing that? She's not using them, Thorn whispered, watching the monitor with tears in his eyes. She's grieving with them. The 300 shards vanished from Moon Primus and materialized at the mouth of the Ceresus moon. General Vrax's fleet was already in formation, their massive prow cannons glowing with the sick green light of planetary cracking energy. The first blast was seconds away from firing. Alara didn't fire back. She didn't charge. She wove the 300 ships into a literal shield, a geodesic sphere of chronal energy that enclosed the moon. The shards rotated at speeds that defied human optics, creating a shimmering, translucent veil of borrowed time. The Korthari fleet opened fire. 80 ships unleashed a volley of plasma that could have turned an ocean to steam. The green beam of the planet cracker struck the sphere with the force of a falling mountain. Alara screamed, not with her mouth but with her soul. She felt the impact in her bones, felt the heat of the Korthari hate pressing against her mind. The ghost network surged, the engrams demanding a counterstrike, demanding blood for blood. No, Alara thought, her grip tightening on the silver seed in her physical hand. We aren't them. We are the orchard. The sphere held. The chronal energy absorbed the impact, scattering the heat into the future, diluting the destruction across 1,000 years of unwritten history. On the bridge of the Korthari flagship, General Vrax stared at his tactical display in disbelief. What is this? Why aren't they firing? Why are they just standing there? They're blocking us, General, his sub-commander said, his voice trembling. Every shot we fire is being siphoned away. We're hitting a wall of time. Then fire everything, Vrax roared. Burn through the wall. They cannot hold that formation forever. The pilot will burn out. Vrax was right. Inside the network, Alara was fading. The soul burn was returning, more aggressive than before. Every time a blast hit the shield, she lost another fragment of her identity. She forgot what a garden smelled like. She forgot the sound of the wind. She forgot what the word peace meant. But she didn't let go of the seed. Commander, your vitals are foobar. Rin's voice was a desperate cry. The feedback is chewing through your primary cortex. You have to break the link. You're going to die. Just one more minute, Alara gasped. She looked through the sensors of the fleet, looking past the Korthari ships, past the fire, toward the Ceresis moon. She saw the colonial domes. She saw the families huddled inside, looking up at the sky. They were small. They were afraid. They were everything. And in that moment, the theme of her existence finally coalesced. The boundary between right and wrong wasn't a line in the sand. It was the choice to carry the weight so that others didn't have to. It wasn't about being a monster to kill a monster. It was about being the light so that the dark had nowhere to hide. I am not a weapon, she told the ghosts, and neither are you. We are the memory of what it means to be alive. The ghost network changed. The rage of the 3rd Infantry didn't vanish. It transformed. It became a collective shield of empathy. The ghosts stopped reliving their deaths and started remembering their lives. They remembered their children, their lovers, their homes. They pooled those memories together, creating a psychic resonance so powerful it began to bleed out of the ships and into the void. The Korthari ships were suddenly bathed in a wave of human memory. General Vrax felt it first. He didn't see an explosion. He saw a human woman holding a child. He heard a human song. He felt the crushing, jagged grief of a mother losing her son to a Korthari pulse bolt. It wasn't a psychic attack. It was a psychic invitation. The Korthari were a species built on the denial of others' pain. Their entire culture was a fortress designed to keep empathy out. But the ghost network was now a flood, and the fortress was made of paper. One by one, the Korthari ships stopped firing. The warriors on the bridges fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sudden, brutal realization of what they had been doing for 3,000 years. They weren't seeing data points or casualties. They were seeing people. Vrax stared at his hands. For the first time in his life, he saw the blood on them. He saw the 62 species his people had broken. He saw Sylas Vane dying on the floor. "Stop," Vrax whispered. "Stop the fire." The guns went dark. The green light of the planet cracker faded. The iron scale, the last bastion of Korthari dominance, sat silent in the dark, its crew weeping for a history they could no longer justify. Inside the Voss, Alara Vance let out a long, shuddering breath. The silver seed fell from her hand, clattering onto the floor. The link severed. Thorn was there before she could fall. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her frail, white-hot body. Alara, stay with me, please. Don't go." She opened her eyes. They were clear, but they were different. There was no blue light, but there was no emptiness either. There was something else, a quiet, ancient wisdom that seemed to have been forged in the fire of the network. "Kalen," she whispered. Her voice was a mere ghost of a sound. "I'm here, kid. I'm right here." "I remember," she said. Thorn's heart stopped. "You do? You remember the orchard? You remember me?" "No," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "I don't remember Alara. Alara's gone. The network took her. But I remember. I remember us. All of us. I remember the morning song. I remember the way the light looks when it's not a weapon." She looked at her hands. I think I know my name now. My name is humanity, and I'm very, very tired." She closed her eyes and drifted into a sleep that had no ghosts. The battle for Ceresis was the last battle of the war. But it wasn't one with Hoa Luke or dreadnoughts. It was one with the one thing the Korthari never thought to weaponize, the truth of what it means to hurt. The transformation had begun, not just for Alara, but for the galaxy. The giants had fallen, but they hadn't been replaced by new giants. They had been replaced by something smaller, something more fragile, and something infinitely more powerful. As Thorn carried her out of the hangar, the technicians stood in silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't salute. They simply watched as the ghost of the orchard was carried into the light. The orchard was safe. The morning song was still playing, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the dark didn't feel so empty. 3 weeks had passed since the silence fell over Ceresis. The galaxy was a different place, quieter, stranger, and filled with the kind of tension that comes when an old world dies and the new one hasn't quite figured out how to breathe yet. Zenith Hub was being dismantled, not by human demolition teams, but by a collective of 12 different species, working together to turn the obsidian fortress into a sanctuary. The petitioner's floor had been renamed the Hall of the Seed, and the blood of Sylas Vane had been replaced by a sapling of a blue-petaled tree, growing toward a ceiling that was now made of recycled sunlight. Kalen Thorne stood in the garden on Moon Primus, watching the tea grow cold once again. But he wasn't alone this time. Ilara sat in a hover chair, her body still recovering from the soul burn. She was thinner than before, her skin possessing a faint, luminous quality that made her look like she was made of moonlight. She didn't have her memories back, not the personal ones. She still didn't know the name of her mother or the layout of her childhood home, but she was no longer empty. The Korthari delegation arrived today, Thorne said, leaning against the cedar bench. They didn't come with warships. They came with books. They want us to help them translate their own history. General Vrax says that after the network hit them, half his crew couldn't even look at a weapon without vomiting. They're experiencing a collective trauma of empathy. It's a hard thing waking up, Ilara said. Her voice had a melodic, resonant quality now, as if the voices of the 3rd Infantry had left a lingering harmony in her throat. To realize that the world you built was made of the bones of others, that's a wound that doesn't heal with a treaty. Rin says the Ghost Network is stable, Thorne continued, his voice cautious. She says the engrams have changed. They're not howling anymore. They're just there, like a library. She thinks we could use it for more than just war. We could use it to share knowledge, to bridge the gap between species that have never understood each other. Ilara looked at him, her gaze piercing. And what does the Council say? The Council is afraid, Ilara. They're afraid of the ghost of the orchard. They see what you did to Vrax's fleet, and they realize that humanity has a weapon that can rewrite a person's soul. They're wondering if we're just the new Korthari, using empathy instead of plasma to conquer. We could be, Ilara agreed softly. The boundary between a teacher and a tyrant is paper-thin, Kalen. If we use the network to force our truth on others, we are no better than Malachor. We have to give them the choice to see, not force their eyes open. Thorne sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. This is Fubar, kid. We won the war, and now everyone is more scared than they were when the lizards were glassing planets. How do we fix that? How do we show them we aren't the monsters? We show them by being small again, Ilara said. She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. The Ghost Network shouldn't be a human project anymore. It should be a galactic one. We put the engrams of every species in there. We put the morning song of the Cathani. We put the mathematics of the Torvathi. We make it a collective memory of the entire galaxy. You want to give away our biggest tactical advantage? Thorne asked, his eyebrows shooting up. It's not an advantage, Kalen. It's a burden. No single species should carry the ghosts of 1,000 worlds. If we share the memory, we share the peace. She looked up at the sapphire gas giant of Ethelgard. I'm going back to the hub next week. They've asked me to speak at the first session of the Unified Council. You? You can barely walk 10 meters without needing a nap. I don't need to walk, Kalen. I just need to tell them the truth. I need to tell them that the reason humanity survived wasn't because we were the strongest or the smartest. It was because we were the only ones who remembered what it felt like to be small. And we can't ever forget that, not even when we're the ones standing behind the door. The afternoon light began to fade, turning the violet meadows into a sea of deep indigo. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer a threat. It was a sanctuary. But deep within the research labs of Moon Aegis 9, a new signal was being recorded. It wasn't Korthari. It wasn't human. It was something from the far edge of the spiral arm, a faint, rhythmic pulsing that sounded like a heart beating in a chest made of ice. The Thessari were coming. They were a species that had never known war because they had never known an equal. They were the architects of a silent, perfect order, and they had been watching the ripples in the chronal field with a cold, analytical curiosity. To them, the fall of the Korthari and the rise of humanity was just a shift in the local ecosystem, a minor disturbance that needed to be restructured. Thorne's wrist comm chirped again. This time the signal was coming from the deep space listening posts. "Captain, we've got something weird." Rin's voice was hushed, almost reverent. "A massive energy signature at the edge of the mapped void. It's not jumping, it's unfolding, like the vacuum itself is opening up." Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The ghost network in her mind hummed, a warning from 1,000 souls who had seen the end of worlds. "They're here," Ilara whispered. "Who?" Thorne asked, his hand hovering over his comms. "The ones who aren't afraid of monsters," she said. She stood up from her chair, her moonlight skin glowing in the twilight. She didn't have her memories of the past, but she had a vision of the future. A future where the patchwork fleet of the galaxy would have to stand together, not for vengeance, but for survival. "Tell the Council to prepare the Hall of the Seed," Ilara ordered. Her voice was no longer that of a child. It was the voice of a commander who had seen the abyss and decided to plant a garden in it. "And tell Rin to open the Ghost Network to the Alani and the Torvathi. We're going to need every memory we have." "Ilara, what are you seeing?" Thorne asked, his face tight with concern. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw the woman she used to be, sharp, brilliant, and utterly fearless. But then the light shifted, and she was the new Ilara, the host of the galaxy's soul. "I see a galaxy that has finally learned how to say no together," she said. "And I see a threat that thinks no is just a suggestion. We've spent 20 years being the small things, Kalen. Now we have to be the thing that stands behind the door." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver seed pin. It was bent and scarred, but it caught the last of the sun's rays shining with a stubborn, unyielding light. "The warning is over," Ilara said. "Now the work begins." The transformation was complete. The commander had become the diplomat, the victim had become the shield. And as the first ships of the Thessari Ascendancy began to cast their shadows over the outer colonies, the human race did something it had never done before. It didn't panic. It didn't mobilize for annihilation. It simply waited. 300 shards of glass and 1,000 years of memory, ready to show the universe that being small was the most dangerous thing you could ever be. The morning song continued to play, its notes weaving through the communication arrays of 89 species. It was no longer a song of grief. It was a song of defiance. "Don't stop," the song whispered across the void. And the galaxy listened. The margin was still narrow. The cost was still absolute. But as Kalen Thorne watched Ilara Vance stand on her own 2 feet and look the unknown in the eye, he knew that Sylas Vane had been right. The most powerful thing in the universe wasn't a gun. It was the patience to let something grow. And the orchard was finally in bloom. The first contact with the Thessari would happen in 10 hours. 10 hours of silence, 10 hours of waiting, 10 hours for 183 species to decide if they were going to be a collection of slaves or a council of equals. Ilara walked back toward the command center, her limp almost gone, her moonlight eyes fixed on the stars. She didn't remember her mother's name, but she remembered the feeling of her hand. And that was enough. "Kalen," she called out over her shoulder. "Yeah, kid? Make sure the tea is hot when I get back. I think I've decided I like it." Thorne smiled, a real, weary, beautiful smile. "You got it, Commander. 2 sugars?" "3, she said. "We're going to need the energy." And with that, the ghost of the orchard stepped into the dark, ready to write the next chapter of a story that would never, ever stop. The vacuum unfolded, the Thessari arrived, and the galaxy, for the first time in its history, didn't flinch. It simply said, "We warned you." And then it began to fight. The struggle for the soul of the galaxy was entering its final phase, and the boundary between right and wrong was about to be tested in a fire that made the Korthari War look like a spark. But the humans were ready. They were the masters of the small thing. They were the keepers of the garden, and they were never ever going to stop growing. The silver seed was planted, and the roots were deep, deep enough to hold up the stars. The arrival of the Thessari Ascendancy was not an event measured in fire, but in the sudden, terrifying absence of it. 1,400 ships, each as large as a planetary capital and as silent as a grave, hung at the edge of the Ethelgard system. They did not broadcast threats. They did not deploy scouts. They simply existed, a wall of white geometric perfection that made the matte black shards of the human fleet look like splinters in a marble hall. Inside the command rig of the Voss, Ilara Vance felt the Thessari presence before the sensors could even name it. It wasn't the heat of the Korthari or the jagged rage of the ghosts. It was a cold, high-frequency hum, the sound of a mind that had solved every equation except for the value of a single life. "They're probing us," Rin's voice whispered through the neural link. She sounded like she was speaking through a layer of frost. "Not our hulls, Ilara. Our data. They're eating the network. They're stripping our memories like they're searching for a bug in the code." Ilara's moonlight skin pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow. She could feel the Thessari's analytical coldness moving through the ghost network, brushing against the engrams of the 3rd Infantry. The ghosts, once so loud and hungry for vengeance, were shrinking back. They were soldiers. They knew how to fight monsters. But how do you fight a civilization that views you as an inefficient variable? "Commander, we've got to do something," Kalen Thorne said from the physical bridge. He was gripping the back of the command rig, his knuckles white. "The Torvathi merchants are already talking about cutting a deal. The Alani are twitching like they're ready to bolt. If we don't show some teeth, this coalition is going to fold before the first shot is even fired." "No teeth, Kalen," Ilara said. Her voice was steady, filtered through 100 layers of static. "They expect teeth. They've cataloged our military capacity. They know we have 300 shards and a ghost driver. They've already calculated that we lose. If we fight them on their terms, we're just confirming their math." "Then what's the plan? We just let them reformat us?" Thorne's voice was gritty, flavored with the frustration of a man who hated being the small thing in the room. "I didn't survive 20 years of ground war just to be deleted by a bunch of oversized calculators." Ilara didn't answer. She dived deeper into the network, moving past the firewalls and the combat protocols. She went to the place where the morning song was stored, the crystalline vibration of the Cathani. She took that song and wrapped it around the engrams of the human soldiers. She began to weave a new tapestry, one that combined the logic of the Torvathi, the endurance of the Alani, and the raw, messy empathy of humanity. "I'm going to talk to them," Ilara said. "Talk to them? They don't have a diplomatic corps, Ilara. They have a restructuring division," Rin shouted. "Then I'll invite them into the garden," Ilara replied. She opened the ghost network, not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as an open door. She broadcast a signal on every frequency, an unencrypted, psychic invitation that bypassed the Thessari's firewalls by offering no resistance. It was a vulnerability so total that it confused the Thessari logic gates. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the vacuum of the Ethelgard system seemed to tilt. Ilara was no longer on the Voss. She was standing in a space that was white, endless, and perfectly still. Across from her stood a figure that looked like a statue carved from a compressed starlight. It had no face, only a shifting lattice of light that suggested a shape. This was the collective mind of the Thessari, the ascendancy. "Variable Vance," the figure said. The voice was not a sound, but a direct injection of thought into her primary cortex. "You have achieved a rudimentary form of collective consciousness. It is impressive for a species of your developmental tier. However, your network is saturated with noise, trauma, grief, inefficiency. We are here to harmonize you. We will remove the noise. You will become adequate." Ilara looked down at her hands. In this space, they were whole. She could see the silver seed pin pinned to her chest. "The noise is the point," Ilara said. "You call it inefficiency. We call it memory. You want to remove the grief, but the grief is the only thing that reminds us why we should care about the joy. Grief is a biological malfunction resulting from the loss of a resource," the Thessari replied. "It serves no purpose in a restructured galaxy. We will replace your grief with order. We will replace your songs with data. The Cathani morning song is a sequence of redundant frequencies. It will be archived and deleted." Ilara felt a spark of the old fire, the Ilara who had led the charge into the Kepler corridor. But she pushed it down. She didn't use the fire. She used the weight. "Let me show you a memory," Ilara said. She didn't show them a battle. She didn't show them the destruction of the Korthari. She showed them Sylas Vane. She showed them the man with the silver seed, standing on the petitioner's floor, knowing he was going to die. She showed them the exact moment the pulse bolt struck his spine and the sadness in his eyes, not for himself but for the people who were killing him. She showed them the morning on Moon Primus, the taste of cold tea, and the way the light hit the gas giant's rings. She showed them the fear of a young pilot named Jax, and the way his sister's name felt like a prayer he had forgotten. The white space began to flicker. The Thessari lattice shifted, the light turning a dull, uncertain gray. This data is non-linear, the Thessari said. It does not calculate. Why would a resource unit sacrifice itself for a non-essential protocol? Why would you protect your enemies at the cost of your own identity? It is illogical. It's not logic, Ilara whispered, stepping closer to the light. It's love. And love is the one thing your restructuring can't account for. Because love is a choice to be small. It's a choice to be vulnerable. It's the decision that the person standing next to you is more important than the math of the universe. She opened the network wider. She let the ghosts of the 3rd Infantry surge forward. But they didn't come with rifles. They came with their stories. 1,000 years of human history, the wars, the art, the mistakes, the redemptions, slammed into the Thessari collective. The Thessari ascendancy had never felt a heartbeat. Now they were feeling billions of them. They were feeling the crushing weight of empathy, the jagged edge of regret, and the soaring irrational hope of a species that refused to stop growing. The white space shattered. Ilara was back in the rig, gasping for air. The monitors on the Voss were screaming with energy spikes. Outside, the Thessari fleet was no longer a wall of perfection. The ships were drifting, their geometric patterns breaking apart, their hulls glowing with a soft, erratic blue light. They're retreating? Rin asked, her voice full of disbelief. No, Ilara said, wiping blood from her lip. They're thinking. For the first time in 10,000 years, they're thinking about something they can't calculate. The Thessari fleet didn't jump. They didn't fire. They slowly turned and moved back toward the edge of the system, their formations loose and messy. They were a civilization in shock, a collective that had looked into the mirror of humanity and found a soul they didn't know how to restructure. The Battle of Ethelgard was over. Not a single shot had been fired. Thorn slumped against the wall of the bridge, his chest heaving. God damn, kid, you did it. You hit them with the one thing they couldn't count. You hit them with us. Ilara looked at the silver pin in her hand. It was glowing faintly, reflecting the light of the gas giant. She felt the ghosts in the network receding, no longer a howling storm, but a quiet, respectful presence. They were at peace. The mission was finally, truly done. But as the adrenaline faded, Ilara felt the cost. She tried to remember the name of the man who had just saved her. She looked at Thorn, and for a terrifying second, his face was just a collection of features. Kalen? She asked, her voice trembling. I'm here, Ilara. I'm right here. I think I'm starting to forget again, she whispered. The network, it's taking the payment. Thorn grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. Let it take it, Ilara. You've got a whole galaxy of people ready to tell you who you are. We've got time. We've got all the time in the world. The aftermath of the Thessari encounter was a quiet, profound transformation. The Korthari remnants, seeing the all-powerful ascendancy retreat before a human diplomat, finally laid down their arms for good. The Torvathi and the Alani signed the Charter of the Seed without a single amendment. The galaxy was no longer a collection of predators and prey. It was a council of survivors. In the weeks that followed, Ilara Vance moved out of the command center. She refused the medals, the titles, and the statues. She went back to the garden on Moon Primus, a woman who had forgotten her past to give the future a chance. She was the small thing that had stood behind the door. And now, finally, she was going to see what happened when the door was open. The morning on Moon Primus arrived with a softness that felt like a secret shared between the stars and the sea. Ilara Vance sat in her usual spot on the white cedar bench, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sapphire gas giant of Ethelgard was just beginning to catch the first light of the system's sun. She was 35 years old, but her hair had turned a shimmering, translucent white, a permanent reminder of the soul burn. She no longer wore the uniform of the Orchard Preservation Corps. Instead, she wore a simple, hand-woven tunic of local silk, the fabric reflecting the violet hues of the meadows. She looked less like a soldier and more like a part of the landscape, a living monument to a war that had been won with silence. Beside her, a small table held a tray of hot tea, 3 sugars. Kalen Thorne had delivered it 10 minutes ago before heading off to the new Unified Council headquarters to yell at a Torvati minister about shipping lanes. He still limped, and he still slept with a knife under his pillow. But he laughed more now. He laughed because the galaxy was no longer a zero-sum game. Ilara picked up her cup, the warmth grounding her in the present. She didn't remember the name of her mother, but she had started a new book. It was a collection of stories, some hers, some from the Ghost Network, some from the people she had saved. She was writing down the memories of a galaxy, weaving them into a single, beautiful thread. A shadow fell over the bench. It was the Cathani delegate, the one they called the Singer. He had grown since the war, his crystalline body reflecting the light in complex, kaleidoscopic patterns. He sat on the grass at her feet, his body humming with a low, peaceful resonance. "The morning song is different today," the Cathani said, his voice like the tinkling of wind chimes. "It has more notes, more colors." "That's because we're all singing it now," Ilara replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver seed pin. It was no longer bent. Thorne had spent 3 days in a machine shop, carefully hammering the metal back into its original shape. It was a perfect circle again, a promise of growth. "Are you happy, Ghost of the Orchard?" the Singer asked. Ilara smiled. It was a small, thoughtful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was genuine. "I don't know if happy is the right word. I feel complete. I feel like a garden that has finally found its season. I lost the Ilara who was born in the dirt, but I found the Ilara who belongs to the stars." She stood up, her movements fluid and sure. She walked to the edge of the garden where a new tree was growing, a blue-petaled sapling, a twin to the one on Zenith Hub. She knelt in the soft, dark soil, her hands moving with a grace that was entirely her own. She wasn't just observing the garden, she was tending it. She dug a small hole near the roots of the tree. She took the silver pin, the one she had carried through the network, the one that had been her tether in the storm, and she placed it in the earth. She covered it with soil, patting it down with her palms. "What are you doing?" the Singer asked. "I'm planting the warning," Ilara said. "I'm burying the weapon so that the seed can use the metal to grow strong. We don't need to carry the pin anymore. We are the circle." She stood up and wiped the dirt from her hands, her moonlight skin glowing in the rising sun. She looked at the horizon, at the dozens of shuttle trails crossing the sky. Each one was a bridge between worlds. Each one was a choice to be small together. She looked back at the bench, at the cold tea and the book of stories. She felt a profound sense of peace, not the peace of an ending, but the peace of a foundation. She had done what Sylas Vane had asked. She hadn't stopped, and in the process, she had found something that was more powerful than any dreadnought or any chronal siphon. She had found her place in the song. "I spent so much of my life thinking that the only way to protect the things I loved was to become something terrifying. I thought that to save the orchard, I had to be the fire that burned the woods down. I lived in a world of mathematics and Holuk, where being small was a death sentence and being monster was the only insurance policy. But sitting here, with the dirt of the garden under my fingernails and the names of the dead humming quietly in the back of my mind, I realized how wrong I was. I don't remember the woman I was before the network. I don't remember her dreams or her favorite songs. But I know she was afraid. I can feel the ghost of her fear, a cold little stone in the center of my chest. She was afraid that if she stopped being a weapon, the universe would swallow her whole. What I learned, what we all learned, is that the universe doesn't swallow you when you're small. It only swallows you when you're alone. We weren't a rounding error because we were few. We were a rounding error because the giants couldn't see the threads that connected us. I am a patchwork of 1,000 souls now, a ghost inhabiting a body that used to have a single name. And yet I have never felt more human. I understand now that humanity isn't a biological category or a list of colony worlds. It's a choice. It's the decision to stay in the room when the lights go out. It's the patience to let a seed grow even when you know you won't live to see the shade. We are the small things that refuse to be erased, not because we are strong, but because we are together. And that is a math that even the stars have to respect. I look at the galaxy now, and I see millions of people trying to find their way in this new quiet light. We all have things we're afraid to lose. Memories, identities, the pieces of ourselves we've spent years building like armor. I had to let go of everything I was to become what the galaxy needed me to be. I wonder, if you were standing at the edge of that same abyss, what is the one piece of yourself you would fight the hardest to keep? And if you let it go, would you be losing yourself? Or would you finally be making room for something larger? Ilara Vance picked up her book and began to write the first sentence of the next chapter. Outside, the morning song grew louder, carrying the voices of 100 worlds into the waiting sky.